And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Life from the Inside Out with Kris. I'm excited to be here with you. This is Dan Winkle, and I will be emceeing today for the episode. And I'm glad you're here with us. We'll be doing some deep trance channeling with Kris in a little while and having some metaphysical chats and wisdom shared with us. So I hope you stick around for this episode. It's going to be really interesting. We might even have a little bit of a topic in mind. Some things came up on our Sunday group where we chat about some of these things. So we'll see if Kris tackles it, but it's good to be with you, Serge.
Hey Dan. Yes, it's been a little while, and that's okay. We're heading into fall now. Oh, seasons are changing and we are changing too.
Yeah. Yeah. Season
Mm.
of letting go.
Yes, trees are good at that. Humans not so much.
We got to listen to the trees.
Well, in my neighborhood, within a 2 block radius, there are 3 or 4 very, very large ginkgo trees. Beautiful leaves, bright, verdant green in the summertime, and then now they're starting to go yellow. And it's funny, they go yellow from the outside in, and when the leaf is all yellow, they drop. So there's a carpet of gold on the ground. It's very pretty, but it's very messy too.
Mm,
A lot of raking. Mind you, it would be nice if that was real gold, but it isn't.
yeah.
And apart from that too, like some of the trees, maple trees are turning now. So yeah, it's going to be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a nice season.
Hmm. Anyways, so shall we go somewhere? Well, shall I go somewhere?
Yeah, I'll go with you. Maybe not completely, but I'll be there. Yeah, I think we'll get going. Let's get going with the show.
Indeed, we trust that you are comfortable.
Oh, yes, Kris, thank you.
And we thank you for your consideration. And we also thank the listeners or the viewers for their collective listening.
Oh, thank you as well.
You might have inadvertently, let's consider it a little subconscious slip of the tongue when you said you'll go there with Joseph. And in some ways, you do. In some ways, every viewer or listener does enter into an altered state. Mind you, human beings play with a vast spectrum of altered states during the course of their waking and sleeping hours, but they might not necessarily be aware for a variety of reasons, some of which include having to mm, take into consideration they have to work for sustenance, for shelter, and so on and so forth. They have preoccupation, and in today's world, it is mostly with social media and especially in this present experience, inflation. So these things preoccupy the individual. So this keeps a certain segment of the population fixed or fixated on a particular range of brainwave patterns, which is not dissimilar from some of the types of brainwave patterns that are used by people in survival mode. My people who are concerned about things that could go wrong in the past, which will have things go wrong in the present, which will have things go wrong in the future, and so on. However, we would like to point out that there are extremely ancient teachings, shall we just say, way back in the day, that gave information that your reality, what you experience, is not caused by external events, conditions, and circumstances. Instead, the mental platform, the mind, is where all these things start. So if you, for instance, subscribe to the idea that at any given moment you will be a victim of some event, some condition, some circumstance, then you will look for anything that matches that narrative that you are telling yourself. It matches the story you are telling. And you will say, oh, here is evidence as to why I have these fears. You attribute causation to an external event, whilst in truth, causation is an internal situation. Otherwise, you just keep playing the victim over and over, which can create all sorts of misalignments of energies in your body and in your mind. So we bring that up because of the question you are going to ask, which is very important and very interesting as well. So please feel free to continue.
Yeah, thanks, Kris. We were having a chat. A number of us in our Sunday group were raised Catholic, sort of this religious background. We were noticing that as a number of our parents aged, developing Alzheimer's or dementia, and uh, sort of in between, we call it in between, halfway in between being physically focused, but then also seeming to be drifting somewhere else. And we were wondering if it, you mentioned safety earlier, is this dementia almost a protective mechanism that they built in because of fear that they've packed into their ideas of the afterlife or even of life here, and so that slow transition helps with that. Can you comment?
Yes, we might be able to comment and perhaps bring a little bit more insight into the situation. So, first of all, it isn't so much as the dementia or Alzheimer's is the result of certain forms of religious excesses. Does that make sense? Hmm? The idea being that perhaps they were forced into a religious system they might have rejected, but were unable to do for whatever reasons, and felt obligated, obliged, or forced to stay within the system, had few other skills and resources, or simply did not want to make any waves or perhaps dramatic changes in their mindset. There might be a smidgen of truth to that. Look at the world you live in. Fast-paced, especially with the advent of social media. Also, people are very concerned what others may think of them. The idea that you live in such a fast-paced world, which is not part of your evolutionary experience, seems to really rock the cradle people feel very insecure, feel unsafe, feel even persecuted. But there is no direct, there might be indirect, but that doesn't necessarily prove causation. Suggestibility that some religious people seem to be happier, whilst some religious people seem to also be unhappy, simply because they will continue to attribute the source of their happiness as dependent upon external events, conditions, and circumstances. There are also a number of non-religious people, whether you refer to them as atheists or whatever, that also have a very similar situation and development. But to say that being religious is the cause of happiness is like saying, if you feel sad and depressed and you drink bourbon and you do not feel so sad and depressed, but if you have sadness and depression, it is because you have a lack of bourbon in your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and right there, this is a bigger topic or issue than just of religion. And the other thing that came up, Kris, that I think is interesting is we thought perhaps it was in relation to fear, particularly fear of death.
There is a certain degree of that, but there is far more so a larger degree of simply wanting to forget many of life's stressors, of life's challenges. Does that make sense? We'll give you an example from Joseph's mother. Her first two relationships, which spanned more than 20 years, were with husbands who were extremely abusive. The second one, a very abusive alcoholic, and she did suffer the brunt of that. And then, though she might have been trying to move on with her life after they both passed away, seemed to come to a certain peaceful arrangement with herself. And then the passing of Joseph's younger sister in 2014, especially at the hands of his younger sister's own husband, started the decline into dementia. And that indicated and this is not a judgment, but an inability to begin to process all of the emotions, both from her early life and her daughter's passing. And she actually refused any form of therapeutic assistance. Thus, her own worldview began to shrink. She cut out a great amount of internal dialogue and conversation, especially in relation to traumatic past events, simply shut them down as a measure of safety, a measure of trying to attain a certain level of peace by blocking all the memories associated with these particular events. To the point where she only had a few narrow perspectives, some of which, of course, devolve into what you would call conspiracies, things that she would conjure up as a means of proving to herself that she might have been a victim. So beliefs or lenses were prominent because that's all she had left. And she eventually completely shut down and passed in mid-March. So there is more of a correlation with dementia and Alzheimer's patients having to do with the eradication or the storing away of traumatic memories. And there might indeed be studies that can shore up this, but it doesn't mean that everyone who has exhibited symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's also had severe traumatic issues throughout their lives, and they simply don't want to remember them. But it is a larger number that do. And in doing so as well, they are more able to free themselves to explore, say, other probable realities or other kinds of memories that you may think doesn't belong to them, but it might actually have bleed throughs to some of their other focuses. So there is no necessarily absolute, clear, black and white line in the sand, if you like. The edges can be blurred, and it will be different for a great variety of individuals. And there might be some correlations between all of their situations, but at the same time, there will be differences because they all have different kinds of lives. And for one person, what would be considered almost a nonchalant situation for another person may end up being quite traumatizing, depending on the particular lenses or belief systems that they adhere to. And belief system is not in relation to any form of religious beliefs or what the individual holds in their own worldview, how they see the world through their lenses. So these are lenses of perception. And it is very, very important to keep these things in mind and not necessarily put everyone in one or two or three different little baskets. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it sounds important to look at each individual and their situation. It sounds like it's really multidimensional why somebody would engage with that.
Yes. And human beings have a very interesting tendency to change things in a manner that is perhaps more convenient, and they will distort things. So, for instance, everyone has heard the idea that you only use 10% of your brain. But that is the popular version. It seemed easier to just say that than to actually take into consideration that the original quotation was that scientific studies have only explored 10% of the human being's use of their brain. It's very different. That means science is still exploring 90% of your human and brain capacity. But people have taken that and ran with the idea, oh, you only use 10% of your brain. It's a very interesting proposition. Take, for example, a famous quote by a famous philosopher, Descartes. Everybody is assured that he said, I think, therefore I am. This is what you learned. he said something quite different. He said, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. That puts a completely different spin on it. So he is saying here that you doubt or question, and your thinking allows you to realize that you are, because you are exploring, you are learning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. Threw me through a little
And
loop.
there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of examples how the popular version of a thing may end up being very different than the original. Much like a interesting subject concerning the Bible. It is assumed that this white Jesus in the Middle East 2,000 years ago had 12 disciples that all had English names. And this is considered absolute truth. English did not even exist back then. And many of the things that appear in the King James versions have been mistranslations. And many books were taken out, and many of the so-called apostles who wrote certain books were actually produced hundreds of years after the fact by people that are unknown at this time. So that is how you create a book of myths, where you threw in certain philosophical perspectives and truths or even semi-truths and consider it to be an absolute work. And anyone who questions it is, of course, the enemy. So how perception influences the individual and the masses is worthy of a much larger second look and a study. It is a very well recognized thing that human beings are highly suggestible. And we mentioned to someone earlier today that before books appeared on the scene, people read from carvings, from clay tablets, cuneiform, or other symbols that were representative of sentences and concepts. Hieroglyphs are concepts that can be broken down. With the advent of books, it was considered the subject of the elite, the intelligentsia, the rulers, if you like. And they would tell, say, the crowd of peasants what they wanted, because the peasants could hardly read and write. In fact, some of them, many of them, were forbidden from learning to read and write. For a very good reason. That way you can keep control of the crowd. And you tell them that the holy book says this. So the peasant complies because it is, after all, a holy book. First, you have to convince the peasant that the book is holy, which is fairly easily done. And then, when Gutenberg did the unthinkable, invented the printing press, and provided readable copies of the Bible, then, oh, how do you say in your expression? All hell broke loose. Because now people started to learn to read because they wanted to know what was in the book. And that's when there were so many splits, dozens, if not hundreds, of groups split from the church because they were convinced that how they read one thing was the truth and the rest was not, which just compounded the problem. But for the most part, the average individual, little Joe Schmo, suddenly had the ability to tap into knowledge. And even to this day, you find archaeological digs and others discover ancient writings, and these are considered highly relevant and almost holy in themselves as a conveyor of absolute truths. So you have all sorts of situations relating to that simply because human beings are highly suggestible. But they often suggest to themselves the things that are most unfavorable to themselves. Does this all make sense to you?
It does. I do realize we're getting towards an end of an episode, and but I do have an interesting idea, and perhaps we can continue with this in the next. It seems like the idea of trying to keep people from, I want to say reading, I think it's morphed a little bit in our day and age, but I see in politics that same thing, wanting to keep the masses ignorant so they'll believe
Yes,
whatever you say. So that I see the modern relevance to what you're saying.
there is that. And this simply because the relation we're trying to make here with Alzheimer's, dementia, and this is that when it comes to a point in life where you want to forget, maybe for you, your life has been a series of stressful events, one after the other, and you want to be done with that. You want to prepare for something else. You want a portion of your energy, of your consciousness, directed at your next adventure without having to go through any more of the struggles and the mental pains and anguishes that you grew up with. You might subconsciously start shutting down, forgetting. Now, of course, some people might object to that, but for the most part, Alzheimer's and dementia is not a disease, it is a symptom, and it is a social symptom. You barely had this 40 or 50 years ago. And without diving too deep into the subject of medical responsibilities, certain medicines might also be responsible, perhaps even indirectly. We are saying this very gently and tongue in cheek. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does.
Indeed. Very quick example. You have high blood pressure, your cholesterol may be a little high, even though cholesterol is extremely important. You are given medication to reduce cholesterol in your system. What is your brain made of?
It's got nerves, but they're all wrapped in fat. The
Yes,
myelin sheath, yes.
fat, cholesterol. So if you take cholesterol medication for a long period of time, something interesting happens at the end of that time. We're not going to openly make the correlation, but you might infer it. We're not certain. We're not saying either that there is absolute proof of this, but it is worth investigating.
Well, one thing we can safely say, or I can safely say as a physician, The number one cause of muscle breakdown is that particular set of medications. We know that's a medical fact within the system, even though it's so widely prescribed.
Indeed.
It's the most common cause of muscle disease is that medication.
Yes. So now you want to have a little break. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
thank
I think we
you
got
for
some
your,
interesting stuff for the next one.
indeed. So we thank you for your consideration. And as the saying goes, arrivederci until the next moment.
See you soon. Bye bye.